This has been a really interesting message to put together. It has not behaved like a normal sermon topic, where on Monday of the week before the sermon, you kind of say, okay, who's out there who wants to be heard? And they sort of show up, and by Tuesday, you've got your arms around them. And, by Friday, it's a nice, neat little box, and you can just write it up, and there you go. Monday, okay, who wants to be heard? Me. No, I'm next, I'm the logic. No, I'm more important. And I'm like, whoa, wait, come on, guys, get together. And they wouldn't get together. They wouldn't coalesce. So it's way too much for one Sunday. So what we're going to do this morning is introduce you to these three loud voices that have been in my head all week. And I think the reason that none of them is given up and said, okay, I'll wait, is that they are all actually important, but they're all related. The closest I can get to a common theme is the out of balance thing, which is why the cover looks like it does and why Kevin's amazing altar creation, look at that, looks like it does. If there is a theme, that's where we're going. But I'm just telling you, it has been a wild and crazy week. So I'm going to introduce you to my three loud voices. The first loud voice says, hey, we got to finish Easter. We're not done yet. Easter was a couple weeks ago. Yeah, but we only got as far as the resurrection. Remember, we talked about circumstantial evidence, how the Gospels all agreed on the empty tomb and Mary Magdalene and the angels. Something happened in the dark, and that was all we had time for. But the Gospels don't stop there. Everyone, well, except for Mark, the other three all have stories of Jesus' appearance after Easter Sunday morning. So we really do need to talk about those stories. So that's the first loud voice. The second loud voice says, we got to finish Earth Day. Earth Day was just last week. We had a really fun service last week. We had what I called Earth Appreciation Day, right? We had poetry and music, art, we had Mary's bark collection, we had all kinds of ways to share our appreciation personally of the earth. What we didn't have time for, because, it's only Sunday morning, was a more theological reflection about Earth Day. And the challenge of the Judeo-Christian tradition in Western civilization, which kind of set aside the pagan notion that Gaia was sacred, which all pre-Christian cultures around the world have a sense that the earth is sacred. But we kind of replaced it with, and you shall have dominion over the earth. It says so right in Genesis, right? And we ran with that for thousands of years, at the beginning, very successfully. We're running, it might be time to revisit that myth. Yeah. So, loud voice. Okay. And the third strand, which really we could do any time, but now seems particularly appropriate, is this observation that over and over again over the years, we keep being drawn back to interest in indigenous wisdom. I mean, we're reading books like Braiding Sweetgrass, or the Kent Nearburn Indian books, or the Hawaii Bowl of Light books, or stories from Celtic Christianity. All these earth-based indigenous wisdoms keep coming back into our consciousness. And the question is not, should we adopt any of them? The question is, why are we so interested? And is that perhaps a symptom of something that is missing for us? So the second two loud voices are pretty related to each other, and we're going to come back to those the next time I preach. So this morning is Let's Finish Easter. Because actually it's related to the other two. It was, anyway. So let's go back to finishing Easter. In the four Gospels, they all treat what happens after Easter Sunday morning differently. Original Mark just quits with the terrified women and has no appearance stories at all. Matthew has Jesus greeting disciples coming back from the tomb, and then a couple of them, and then he meets them on the mountain in Galilee where he gives them the Great Commission. Go out and preach the gospel to all the world. In Luke is such a good storyteller. Jesus walks with two of them on the road to Emmaus. And then he appears among all of them in Jerusalem, leads them as far out as Bethany, and ascends. In Luke, Jesus actually ascends, which is kind of interesting. And then there's John. John has at least 4 appearance stories. He appears to Mary Magdalene alone in the garden. He appears to the disciples in a locked room. They can't figure out how he got in. He just shows up. But Thomas wasn't there, so he's got to come back to talk to Thomas. And then finally, there's the whole breakfast on the beach scene with catching, putting the net on the other side of the boat, hauling in the 153 fish, which we've talked about before. And that story with the breakfast on the beach ends with the passage that David read about the putting the belt around you and taking you where you do not want to go. And what's that about? Yeah, okay. So the first question is, why are these appearance stories all different? There's like 0 agreement between them. And we have to remember that the gospel stories were written for slightly different audiences. We ran into that when we talked about the difference in the Christmas stories. Written originally for different audiences. And in the appearance stories, they're trying to capture people's responses to some experience of spirit. And those responses are going to depend on the people having the experience. And so they're going to be different. And what stories ended up being held in particular communities, it's actually not too surprising that they're not all the same. A question that is particularly intriguing, I think, is why in the stories in Luke and John do Jesus' friends not recognize him? Right? Mary Magdalene in the garden thinks he's the gardener until he speaks. The 2 men on the road to Emmaus, they talk to him all afternoon. And it's not until they broke bread together in the evening that they realized who they were talking to. Yeah, there's a message in there somewhere. Perhaps, well, here's a shot. Perhaps it's that they didn't recognize him because he actually had changed in some undefinable way. He'd been through a great trauma, and trauma changes people. They can survive it in some form, but they never go back to exactly what they were before. You've probably had that experience at some point in your life where you had to endure something that was traumatic. You can't go back, but you can go on. And I think we're going to see that theme come up again. The stories in John are particularly intriguing to me because John's the gospel that's different from the other 3. It's the most mystical, in some ways, the most Gnostic leaning, but not so far leaning that he wasn't going to be acceptable by the church fathers putting the Bible together. But you can tell in the community that followed John that Mary Magdalene had an important position, perhaps more so than in any of the other individual communities. To tell the story that Jesus appears first to Mary Magdalene all by herself says she was a person of some importance to that community. And then in the beach story, when they catch 153 fish, you remember, if you were here for the Sunday when we did sacred numbers, and we talked about the 153, that is the value by gematria of the Magdalene. And that, the audience for which John was written, which this community that the Johannine community it's called, that followed John, they would have been steeped in gematria because that was the second language in those days. And so to literally say 153 in that story, they would have, oh, Mary's there. Not mentioned by name, mentioned by indirection. So if you understood the code, then you got that it was an invocation of the Magdalene. So in that beach scene at the end, after breakfast, is the famous "Feed My Lambs" conversation that Jan Lamphere used to love so much. This is Peter and Jesus talking, and Jesus asked, "Do you love me, Peter?" "Of course I do." "Feed my lambs." But it's not enough to ask him once, he has to ask him twice. "Do you love me, Peter?" "Of course I do." "Tend my sheep." And the last time it's "feed my sheep." It's like seriously asking his question. And then comes this I think it's odd little coda to that chapter. "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." And then in parentheses, in case you didn't understand what that was about, which we don't, he said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. In parentheses. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." So the idea is that you will stretch out your hands. It's not like this, it's like this, because the legend is that Peter was crucified in Rome, just the way Jesus was. That's the standard interpretation that we all learn. But if you read this, and this is playing fast and loose with Bible verses, but that's part of the joy of reading the Bible, is that you get to interact with it. If you read it at a much more global level, where the "you" is all of us, a paraphrase might sound something like this, and I'm going to leave out the thing in parentheses because I'm going for a different interpretation. When you were younger, you could choose to do whatever you wished. But when you grow old, you have to bear the consequences of those choices, and they may lead you where you do not wish to go. Because of that, my advice to you is to follow me. Do what I do. Make the choices I would make. Circling back around to Earth Day and the need for some theological reflection on the sacredness of the earth, it's really not part of our Judeo-Christian tradition, except sort of it's kind of off to the side. I mean, yes, of course, Gaia is sacred, but we don't put it front and center the way the indigenous wisdom traditions do. And it feels like we are beginning to pay the price for that shift in focus on the sacredness of the place that we live. And it may be, we think about the planet in terms of the symptoms of that underlying problem, and it might be time to think about, sort of at a fundamental level, changing or adding to the cultural myth, if you will, or mindset, myth in the Joseph Campbell sense, that those stories that tell us who we are and that guide our lives, so that Gaia becomes a central piece of it again, like the indigenous wisdom that we keep being drawn back to, that never lost the sense that Gaia is sacred. And is that perhaps why we are drawn back in all different, it's all around the world, it's not any particular one. But they have something that we not only don't have, but that we are facing the consequences of not having. And we could perhaps spend some time thinking about what is the place, what is the role of Gaia in the Judeo-Christian sense of the world? Because when we lost the Gaia is sacred idea, we not only opened the door to the abuses that have happened, but we lost the sense of the divine feminine. That's where it was enshrined. The earth is, in some sense, the manifestation of the goddess Gaia. And when we took that out of our theology, we unbalanced the world. Not just our religion, we lost our balance in the world. And that's what we're feeling. We're feeling a lack of, like I stand on 2 feet and the world is solid. It's, I don't know. And the farther we lean towards tech and AI and virtual et ceteras, the more out of balance we get. We begin to look like that picture on the cover of the Bulletin, which I really don't understand how that guy makes those rocks do that. It doesn't look like it should work. And it does if you don't move anything. I don't know. There's some big ideas there, and we're not going to develop them this morning. I wanted to plant some seeds, and we're going to water them. And the next time I come to preach, we will talk more about the role of Gaia in our mythology. How do we put her back? Okay, all right, that's enough for today. Now you can all be distressed about this collection of ideas that won't be quiet. Okay, talk back. Yes, Stephen.
Well, when you said the divine feminine and also